He thought his wife was faithful for 9 years, until one night her secret unraveled. But the way he took revenge? You won't believe what he did next. I discovered my wife, Sarah, was cheating last March, and since then, I've been living in a personal hell. At first, I couldn't believe it. We had been married for just over 9 years, and until then, I had been the happiest man in Phoenix, Arizona. Psychiatrist Dr. Karen Lawson once said that when someone faces the reality of impending disaster or extreme emotional trauma, they go through emotional stages: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. I remembered hearing about this during a psychology class back in college. Denial is the first stage, and I was deep in it. If Sarah was cheating, our marriage was dead. But how could she? I wondered if I would go through all the stages of grief for the death of our love. And even if I reached acceptance, would the pain and heartbreak haunt me forever? I met Sarah in college when I was studying computer engineering at Arizona State University. Part of the general education requirements included taking a literature class, which I wasn't exactly thrilled about. I didn't look forward to reading stories or poetry written by long-dead authors. I figured my mind was better suited for coding and maybe figuring out where the next party would be. I wasn't the most social guy on campus, your typical computer geek. At 6 feet 2 inches and a little on the skinny side, I wasn't anyone's first pick for sports. I wasn't active in any clubs or organizations, but I was great with computers. People would recognize me, maybe say hello, but more often than not, they wouldn't remember my name. My love life? Non-existent before meeting Sarah. My only other relationship had been with Amanda Smith, someone from my hometown. We had dated for about 3 months after high school, and I always felt she was with me out of pity. After that, my nerdy friends and I would hang out, swapping exaggerated stories about how great we were with women, though most of us hadn't had much real experience. But when I met Sarah, everything changed. We were sitting next to each other in literature class, and from the moment I saw her, I was captivated by her. Sarah had bright green eyes that seemed to pull me in. I barely noticed anything beyond those eyes during our first class, but as she stood up to leave, I got a better look at her. She had shoulder-length blonde hair with a slight wave, a cute button nose, and lips that naturally curved into a smile. She wasn't tall, probably around 5 feet 4 inches, and she dressed simply, but she wore everything well. Her figure was perfectly proportioned, and she carried herself with confidence. Every day after that, I made sure to sit next to Sarah in class. After about 6 weeks, she finally spoke to me. She noticed my calculus books and asked if I could tutor her. She said she was struggling with college algebra and needed to pass the class to graduate. I would have agreed to anything she asked at that moment. We started meeting in the library on Mondays and Wednesdays after class. Trying to stay focused on math while sitting next to the most beautiful girl I'd ever seen was nearly impossible. Still, something must have clicked because Sarah got a B on her midterm exam. She was so excited that she jumped up, gave me a hug, and kissed me on the cheek. I was over the moon. Then, in a moment of uncharacteristic boldness, I asked her if she wanted to go see a movie on Friday. "Sure," she said. "What time?" I somehow managed to stammer out an answer, and she smiled. I don't think my feet touched the ground all the way back to my dorm room. The rest of the week passed in a blur. I even went out and bought a new shirt and a pair of jeans for our date. My friends made fun of me, but I didn't care. Friday finally arrived, and I was nervous, but excited. We went to see a thriller at a local theater in Phoenix, the kind of movie full of jump scares and suspense. I figured Sarah would be scared and want to sit close to me. That didn't happen, but we still had a great time. We whispered through the movie, guessing which character would be killed off next. She was right most of the time, and afterward, she gave me a quick goodnight kiss on the doorstep of her dorm. On our 4th date, Sarah invited me up to her room, and that night we made love for the first time. It was awkward and clumsy, but it must have been good for her because she invited me up again after our next date. Before long, we were officially a couple. I was amazed at how much we had in common. We loved the same books, the same movies, and even shared a love for spicy food, which was a rare find in my previous relationships. By the end of that semester, I was sure I was in love. Sarah and I were inseparable, even though we didn't have any classes together the next term. We still studied together, met for lunch, and spent every free moment with each other. Right before winter break, we were lying on her bed when I told her, "I love you." She smiled and said, "I love you too." Those were the happiest days of my life. After winter break, we picked up right where we left off. It felt like nothing could go wrong between us. When spring break rolled around, we rented a small cabin by Lake Pleasant. I had planned on going hiking and maybe fishing, but we hardly left the cabin. We spent the whole week wrapped up in each other, and on the last night, I got down on one knee and asked her to marry me. Sarah said yes without hesitation. 6 months later, we graduated, and 4 months after that, we were married. After college, I got a job in computer security at a local firm. The company specialized in integrating security software for small businesses in and around Phoenix. My boss, Mike Thompson, had started the company with just 2 employees over a decade earlier. But after a few mergers and buyouts, the company had grown to about 50 employees. Business was good, and Mike was not only a great boss, but also a mentor. Sarah found work right after graduation as an office manager for Dr. Howard Williams, a dentist in Phoenix. He was a bit scatterbrained, but had a stellar reputation as one of the best dentists in the area. Patients came from all over the state just to see him. When Sarah first started working there, the office was in complete disarray. Unpaid bills, lost files, and an outdated billing system. But Sarah turned it all around. After 5 years, the practice was running smoothly. Revenues were up, and the office staff turnover had dropped to nearly 0. I was so proud of her. After we got married, Sarah and I moved into a small apartment near my job in Phoenix. We were both career-focused, so we agreed to wait a few years before starting a family. Every year, around our anniversary, we took a vacation. In the early years, we didn't have much money, so we went back to the same cabin by Lake Pleasant. Over time, though, our vacations became a little more luxurious. One year, we spent a week in the Dominican Republic at an all-inclusive resort, soaking in the sun and enjoying life. After 6 years in the apartment, we decided it was time to buy a house. We spent a few months looking and finally found the perfect home with enough space for our future family. It wasn't large, but it was cozy and just what we needed. We moved in, and life was good. We still weren't quite ready for kids, but everything else seemed to be falling into place. About 8 years into our marriage, Sarah came home from work one day with big news. Her hard work managing Dr. Williams's dental office was getting noticed. A couple of high-profile executives who were patients had been asking about her. They saw the transformation in the office and were impressed. One of them approached Sarah with a job offer. That night, we sat down to discuss it. I felt like we were finally on the verge of starting a family, and I worried that her taking this new job might set us back a few years. We didn't need the extra money, and Dr. Williams had become almost like family to us. Sarah argued that this new position could lead to even bigger opportunities down the road, and she promised me that she'd make up for the delay. Reluctantly, I agreed. A month later, she started her new role as the personal assistant to Tom Harper, Vice President of Finance at Crescent Capital, a major firm in the city. What I didn't realize at the time was that Crescent Capital was the venture capital firm that had recently bought out the company I worked for. I had no idea our lives would become so entangled. At first, nothing seemed to change between Sarah and me. Sure, she worked longer hours and had more responsibilities, but I trusted her completely. As time went on, however, I started to notice small things. Our intimacy began to decline, and she seemed tired more often. She occasionally had to work late into the evening or attend dinner meetings with her boss, but I figured it was all part of her demanding new job. Over the next few months, our sex life took a significant hit. I tried to make things special, planning dates or surprising her with little gestures, but Sarah seemed distant, uninterested in my advances. We didn't make love for 2 months leading up to her company's annual awards dinner, but I never suspected anything. The idea that Sarah might be unfaithful simply didn't cross my mind. I learned the truth on the night of that awards dinner. Each year, Crescent Capital hosted a big gala to celebrate its success and honor the employees who had contributed to the company's achievements. Sarah and I were invited to attend, and she was particularly excited because Tom Harper, her boss, was being recognized with an award. Despite everything, I still couldn't believe she might be cheating on me, but doubts were starting to creep in. As we got ready for the event, I paid close attention to everything. How she did her makeup, how much perfume she applied, even the underwear she chose. I was looking for any sign that might confirm the suspicions I had buried deep down. We arrived at the venue right on time. As soon as we entered, Sarah rushed off to help make sure everything was running smoothly. About 20 minutes later, Tom Harper walked in, his wife Lauren on his arm. Lauren was stunning, tall, elegant, and the kind of woman who commanded attention. I found myself wondering why Harper would need someone like Sarah when he had Lauren waiting for him at home. I got a drink from the bar and watched Harper for a while. He was the center of attention, and people seemed to flock to him as if he were royalty. It didn't take long before Sarah appeared at his side, smiling and laughing as they exchanged words. I watched them closely. The way they interacted, the way Harper touched her arm, the glances they exchanged. It was clear there was something more than a professional relationship going on between them. As the night continued, we were seated at different tables for dinner. Harper and Lauren sat at the head table, while Sarah and I were placed nearby. She chose a seat facing Harper, and throughout the meal I noticed the way she kept glancing at him. My stomach churned, but I pushed the feeling down, trying to focus on anything else. After dinner, the tables were cleared to make room for dancing. I tried to keep Sarah close to me on the dance floor, but every few minutes she found some excuse to run over to Harper, to help him with a task, to check on some detail. Each time they were together, I watched. I couldn't help it. My eyes followed their every movement, the way they smiled at each other, the little touches on the arm, the quiet whispers. At one point, I saw Harper's wife, Lauren, glance over at them, but she seemed completely unaware of the subtle chemistry between Sarah and her husband. We danced a few times that evening, some slow dances, others fast. During the slow dances, I held Sarah close, but it felt like she was pulling away emotionally. By midnight, I was exhausted and suggested we head home. Sarah agreed, but not before asking for one last dance. That final dance changed everything. As I held Sarah in my arms, I realized something was off. She wasn't wearing the underwear she had on earlier. I had noticed it during our previous dances, but now, her backside was smooth. There was no trace of the black lace thong I had seen her put on before we left the house. My heart sank as the horrible truth hit me. She had taken it off, and I knew exactly why. She hadn't done it for me. We left the event soon after. The car ride home was painfully silent. I couldn't bring myself to speak, and Sarah didn't seem interested in filling the void. When we got home, she rushed upstairs, mumbling something about needing a shower. I muttered a response, but my mind was elsewhere. I went through the motions, hanging up my suit and climbing into bed. But sleep didn't come. A few minutes later, Sarah crawled into bed next to me, wearing her long cotton nightgown. She leaned over, kissed me on the cheek, and said, "Wasn't that a great night?" I pretended to be asleep, avoiding her. She turned away, and within minutes, I heard her breathing slow as she fell asleep. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing with thoughts I couldn't control. I wanted to scream, to cry, to confront her, but instead, I lay there in the dark, tears silently streaming down my face, soaking into the pillow. The next morning, I stood under the hot water of the shower, letting it wash over me as my emotions ran wild: anger, pain, betrayal, and confusion. How had this happened? Had I been blind to the signs? Was I not enough for her? Had I done something wrong? My thoughts bounced around in my head, overwhelming me. But as I stepped out of the shower, one feeling stood out above all the others: rage. I knew I had to do something. They couldn't get away with this. Over the next few days, I began to plot my revenge. I didn't know exactly how I would make them pay, but I knew I had to act. Harper wasn't going to get away with ruining my marriage. And Sarah, she had lied to me, betrayed me in the worst possible way. I wasn't sure what my next step would be, but I knew I couldn't just sit back and let it continue. Then, One afternoon while Sarah was out shopping, I saw her laptop sitting on the kitchen counter. That's when the idea hit me. As a computer security expert, I knew my way around a system, and I figured it wouldn't be too hard to find something that could bring Harper down. I turned on Sarah's laptop and connected to her work system. The login screen popped up, prompting me for a password. I hesitated for a moment, wondering if I was really about to do this. But then I remembered Sarah's day planner sitting nearby. She had always been organized, almost to a fault. I opened it up and flipped through the pages until I found it. Her password, written neatly in the margin. Classic mistake. I typed in the password and gained access to the system. It was a treasure trove of information. Sarah had access to nearly everything at Crescent Capital. Payroll, accounting, purchasing, you name it. But what I was really looking for was something tied to Harper. I didn't have to dig far. His email was easy to find, as was his personal information. I even found his passwords, credit card numbers, and bank account details all neatly stored in Sarah's files. Jackpot. After making a quick trip to a copy shop to photocopy Harper's personal information from Sarah's files, I began planning my next move. I didn't want to rush things. This had to be perfect. I knew that Harper was the key to making Sarah's life crumble as well. If I could bring him down, she'd go down with him. But it wasn't enough just to ruin him professionally. I wanted to hit them where it hurt most. A few days later, when Sarah left for the gym, I made my move. I booted up her laptop, logged into the work system using her password, and started exploring the accounting department. It didn't take long to figure out how the invoices were processed. After an invoice was entered into the system, it had to be approved before being paid. I saw my opportunity. I created a few small invoices, nothing too noticeable, and entered Harper's bank account information in the rebate fields. Once these were approved, the funds would be sent directly to his account, but I was counting on the auditors to catch it later. I made sure the amounts were small enough that they wouldn't raise immediate red flags. Once Harper got caught, everything would unravel. I closed out the system, shut down the laptop, and poured myself a drink. Days went by, and nothing happened. There were no signs that Harper or anyone else had noticed the missing money. Frustrated, I decided to raise the stakes. I accessed the system again and added another set of invoices, this time increasing the rebate amount slightly. I routed some of the money to Sarah's new accounts, which I had set up at a few local banks. Still, nothing happened. Meanwhile, life at home had become unbearable. Sarah and I barely spoke, and when we did, it was cold and distant. She no longer showed any interest in me, and the thought of touching her made me feel sick. Knowing she had given what was once ours to another man was enough to make my stomach turn. Several times after a quick kiss or a brief embrace, I would find myself running to the bathroom, overcome with nausea. Then things took an interesting turn. One day, Mike, my boss, called me into his office. He said that corporate had specifically requested me for a job in San Francisco, updating security systems at one of our branch offices. I was confused. That wasn't typically the kind of work I did. But Mike explained that corporate insisted, so I had no choice but to agree. I realized immediately that this was Harper's doing. He wanted me out of the way for a few days, so he could have uninterrupted time with Sarah. I felt the rage bubbling up inside me, but I knew better than to let it show. I agreed to go on the trip, pretending not to care. Later that night, I mentioned the trip to Sarah over dinner. She could barely hide her excitement when I told her I'd be gone for the next week. When I asked her what she had planned, she fumbled for an answer, eventually claiming she'd just spend time with her friends. I pretended not to notice the lie, but I knew she was looking forward to seeing Harper. The next day, I opened 2 new bank accounts in Sarah's name at different local banks. This was all part of my revenge plan. When Sarah went out for her usual gym session, I logged into her work system again, this time using Harper's password. I altered a few more invoices, sending some rebates to the accounts in Sarah's name and others to Harper's. Over the next several weeks, this routine continued. My trips to San Francisco, Chicago, and Miami gave me plenty of opportunities to move money around. I opened offshore accounts in the Bahamas and the Cayman Islands, sending stolen funds into these new accounts. I was careful not to make any moves that would raise suspicion, but my plan was expanding, and the money was accumulating faster than I had imagined. Meanwhile, life at home continued to deteriorate. Sarah and I had become more like roommates than husband and wife. She avoided intimacy, and I avoided confrontation. The few times we did speak, it usually ended in arguments over the most trivial things: how I loaded the dishwasher or left a cup on the counter. I was convinced she manufactured these arguments just to distance herself further from me, but that was fine. I had my own game to play. Then came an opportunity I couldn't resist. Sarah had a lunch meeting scheduled with Harper, and I decided to make my move. I ordered a dozen roses and had them delivered to Sarah's office while she was out. When I arrived at her office, the women there gushed over how sweet I was, calling me the perfect husband. I asked if I could leave the flowers on her desk, and they happily agreed. Once alone in Sarah's office, I quickly logged into her computer. I altered a few more invoices and sent the stolen money to Harper's account. I also left a digital trail on Harper's computer, knowing it would lead back to him if the auditors ever caught on. Then, as I was about to log out, I found something interesting. Photos stored in Harper's personal folder. Explicit pictures of Sarah in compromising positions. It stung, but by now I was too numb to feel much of anything. I copied the images onto a thumb drive, thinking they might come in handy later. I left the office just as Sarah returned from her meeting, smiling at the sight of the flowers. She was so happy that night, praising me for being romantic. But I knew the truth. It was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. Over the next few weeks, I continued to bide my time, fine-tuning my revenge. Life with Sarah had become a shell of what it once was. She tried to be more affectionate, cooking dinner more often, and even making small attempts to connect with me. But I wasn't interested. The damage was done, and nothing she did could change the way I felt. My mind was focused on the end game, and I knew that my plan would soon come to fruition. Then, one day, Mike called me into his office again. He said the San Francisco office had been pleased with my work, and now corporate wanted me to go to Chicago to do the same. I knew what this meant. Harper was once again orchestrating these trips to get me out of town so he could have more time with Sarah. But I played along, agreeing to go. Each trip was another opportunity to move money and deepen the trail that would eventually lead to Harper's downfall. In Chicago, I finished the work quickly, leaving me with plenty of free time. I continued to access Sarah's work system from my hotel room, sending more funds to offshore accounts in places like the Bahamas and Switzerland. The money was stacking up, and I was growing more confident that everything would soon blow up for both Harper and Sarah. After Chicago, they sent me to Miami. This time I took a short flight to the Cayman Islands, where I opened another account in Sarah's name. Each new offshore account was another piece of the puzzle, and I felt a sense of satisfaction as my plan came together. The more time I spent away from Sarah, the more I realized that there was no salvaging our relationship. We had become strangers, sharing the same roof. Back at home, things between Sarah and me were cold and distant. She had stopped trying to be affectionate, and I no longer cared. My only focus was on making sure they both paid for what they had done. At night, I would sit up late, watching sports on TV just to avoid going to bed with her. Any attempt to be close was met with manufactured arguments over small things, like leaving dishes in the sink or forgetting to take out the trash. It was clear to me that she was using these arguments to avoid intimacy, and I let her. It was easier than pretending things were fine. Then came my favorite part of the plan, an opportunity to plant a deeper seed of destruction. One day, I found Sarah's calendar and noticed she had a lunch date scheduled with Harper at a local upscale cafe, the Copper Spoon, in Phoenix. This cafe was a well-known spot for executives, but what they didn't know was that I had my own plan for that day. I timed everything perfectly. While they were at lunch, I delivered another dozen roses to Sarah's office. When I arrived, her coworkers gushed over what a wonderful husband I was. I smiled, playing my part, and asked if I could leave the flowers on her desk. They happily obliged. Once inside her office, I logged into her computer and left a few more breadcrumbs, ensuring that the digital trail would eventually lead back to Harper. I also altered a few more invoices, directing the stolen funds to the accounts I had set up for Harper and Sarah. Feeling bold, I then walked down the hall to Harper's office, which was conveniently unlocked. I slipped inside and repeated the process on his computer. As I snooped through his files, I found even more personal photos of Sarah, taken during their illicit encounters. I copied everything onto my thumb drive, knowing these images could be useful if Sarah tried to deny the affair. That night, Sarah came home beaming, thrilled by the roses. She gushed about how thoughtful I was and even tried to be affectionate, something she hadn't done in months. But I saw through her act. She was just trying to cover her tracks, to make me believe everything was fine between us. Little did she know that I had already seen the explicit photos of her with Harper. Our romantic evening ended the way it always did, with Sarah pretending everything was normal and me silently seething. I smiled through it all, knowing the storm was coming. A few weeks later, Mike called me into his office again. This time, corporate wanted me to go to Boston. I had grown tired of these sham work trips, knowing they were nothing more than Harper's attempt to keep me out of town. But I agreed, knowing it was another chance to set my plan in motion. In Boston, I completed the security upgrades quickly, and then took a detour to Zurich, Switzerland, to open yet another offshore account. By the time I returned home, I had moved most of the money into various accounts scattered across different countries. Back in Phoenix, things between Sarah and me continued to deteriorate. We were living as roommates, avoiding each other as much as possible. She spent most of her time either at work or out with her friends, while I spent my time working on my plan or finding ways to stay away from her. There was nothing left between us but the empty shell of what our marriage used to be. Finally, the day came when it all started to fall apart. One afternoon, while I was in Los Angeles on another work trip, Sarah called me in a panic. She said an audit was being conducted at Crescent Capital and things were starting to look bad. She told me she would be working late and might not be home until very late that night. I sipped my drink by the hotel pool, pretending to be concerned, but inside, I was thrilled. The storm was finally here. The next day, I moved the last of the stolen funds into offshore accounts and prepared for the fallout. I had made sure that none of the money could be traced back to me, and I knew it was only a matter of time before Harper and Sarah were caught. The headlines the following morning confirmed what I had been waiting for. Phoenix executive and assistant in massive embezzlement scandal. The article detailed how funds had been siphoned from Crescent Capital's accounts for personal use by both Tom Harper and Sarah. Authorities had traced the money to several offshore accounts, including some in the Cayman Islands and Switzerland. Both Harper and Sarah had been arrested, and bail was set at $1 million each. I couldn't help but smile as I read the news from my hotel room in Los Angeles. That afternoon, Sarah called me, her voice trembling with fear. She explained what was happening, insisting that it was all a mistake and that she had done nothing wrong. I pretended to be supportive, telling her that we'd get through this and that I would come home as soon as possible. In reality, I was savoring every moment of her panic. The next day, I arrived back in Phoenix and went straight to the courthouse. I used our house as collateral to post Sarah's bail. After hours of waiting, she was finally released, and we drove home in silence. Sarah was a wreck, her eyes were red from crying, and she could barely get a word out. I said nothing, letting the tension hang between us. When we got home, Sarah rushed upstairs, muttering something about needing a shower to wash off the jail smell. I poured myself a scotch and waited downstairs, thinking about how perfectly everything had played out. A few minutes later, Sarah came downstairs, wrapped in her bathrobe, her face still pale and tear-streaked. She sat across from me at the kitchen table, her voice barely a whisper as she said, "I didn't do anything. I'm innocent. This is all just a misunderstanding." She didn't mention the affair. She didn't bring up Harper or try to deny anything. It was as if she thought we could just ignore it all and pretend nothing had happened. But I wasn't about to let her off that easily. I told her we'd get a lawyer and fight the charges, playing the part of the supportive husband. But in my mind, I was already planning my next move. Over the next few weeks, as the case against Sarah and Harper built, the atmosphere in our house grew colder. Sarah spoke less and less, retreating into herself as the trial approached. Meanwhile, I had already met with a divorce attorney and had the paperwork ready to go. I was just waiting for the right moment. The trial only lasted 3 days, and the media attention had already shifted to other scandals by the time it began. The prosecution laid out a clear case, tracing the stolen funds back to Harper and Sarah through their login credentials and work computers. The defense tried to argue that their passwords could have been hacked, but the evidence was overwhelming. The jury didn't take long to deliberate. The day the verdict was read, I sat next to Sarah in the courthouse conference room. She was trembling, terrified of what was coming. That's when I decided it was time to end it all. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the divorce papers, sliding them across the table to her. Sarah's hands shook as she took them, her eyes widening in shock. "I could have filed for adultery," I said quietly. "But I didn't." She looked up at me, her mouth hanging open, unable to speak. "I have proof, Sarah. Pictures," I said, watching the color drain from her face. She tried to stammer out a denial, but I cut her off. I reached into my jacket and pulled out a stack of photos. The first one showed me and Lauren Harper standing together at the top of the Golden Gate Bridge. "Not adultery on your part," I said calmly, "but on mine." Her confusion deepened as I continued. "After last year's company awards dinner, Lauren came to me. She had hired a private investigator to follow Harper and had proof of his affairs. Yes, plural. He's been unfaithful to her with more than just you." I paused for a moment, letting the words sink in. I didn't believe it at first. Not until I saw the way you looked at him that night. But by then, I already knew. I knew what was going on. And I knew he had taken your panties. Sarah flinched at the mention of the panties, but I pressed on. I reached into my jacket again and pulled out another stack of photos. These ones of me and Lauren in various cities: Boston, Miami, and Seattle. We spent time together. At first it was just talking, comparing stories of betrayal, but eventually we became something more. Then I handed her the final set of photos, the explicit ones I had taken from Harper's computer. Sarah's eyes filled with tears as she flipped through them, her hands trembling. "If you had just come clean, Sarah, maybe we could have worked through this. Maybe I could have forgiven you. But it's too late for that now." I stood up and left the room before the verdict was even read. By the time Sarah and Harper were both found guilty, I was already packed and ready to leave Phoenix behind for good. Harper was sentenced to 7 years in prison, and Sarah got 3, with 2 additional years of probation. Since none of the stolen money had been recovered, the sentences were harsh. I had already sold the house, with half of the proceeds going into an escrow account for Sarah, along with half of our savings. I didn't want any of it. I had more than enough waiting for me in the offshore accounts. That night, I boarded a plane to Nice, France, leaving my old life behind. I rented a small house in the hills overlooking the Mediterranean Sea in Nice, France. It wasn't luxurious, but it was peaceful, and after everything that had happened, that's all I wanted. I spent most of my days sitting on the veranda, sipping wine and watching the sun set over the water. I didn't have much contact with anyone, and for the first few months, that's how I preferred it. Lauren Harper visited a couple of times. Our relationship never developed beyond what it had become. Friends with benefits. She had done well in her divorce from Tom, walking away with a sizable settlement, and she was ready to move on. We talked about what had happened, and she knew all about the scheme I had used to bring Tom and Sarah down. She found it fitting, but it didn't seem to bother her much anymore. Lauren had found peace, and she was looking forward to building a new life. As for me, I was still trying to come to terms with everything. While the money I had secured in offshore accounts would support me for the rest of my life, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had lost something more important. The betrayal, the revenge, it had all taken its toll. I wasn't proud of the man I had become. In fact, I barely recognized myself anymore. To pass the time, I started a small online business, writing software for small companies, similar to what I had done for Mike's firm back in Phoenix. It wasn't much, but it gave me something to do. I even got an email from Mike one day, complimenting my work and offering to send a few clients my way. It felt good to have something productive to focus on, but the weight of what I had done still hung over me. I had taken revenge on Sarah and Harper, but at what cost? I had betrayed my own morals, becoming someone I had never thought I could be. I had the money, the house, and the freedom to live my life on my terms. But something was missing. The bitterness of betrayal lingered, and I wasn't sure if I could ever let it go. 1 year after the trial, I was still living alone in my little house, my only company the waves crashing against the shore. Lauren had moved on. She had met someone new, and while we still exchanged the occasional email, our connection had faded. I didn't resent her for it. She had found a way to rebuild her life, and I was happy for her. I, on the other hand, wasn't sure where I was headed. I had closed myself off, unsure if I could ever trust someone again. The dark side of me that had surfaced during my revenge still lingered, and I wasn't sure if I could shake it. Then, one day, while sitting at a small cafe in Nice, I noticed a blonde waitress smiling at me. She had been serving me for weeks, but I had barely paid attention. This time, though, her smile felt warmer, more genuine. It caught me off guard. Maybe there was still hope for me after all. Maybe, if I let myself heal, I could find a way to move on, to rebuild, just like Lauren had. I didn't know where the path would lead, but for the first time in a long time, I felt a glimmer of possibility. Perhaps somewhere down the line, I would find a way to open my heart again.